The greatest medieval monument isn't Notre Dame or the Tower of London. It's a crumbling road you've never heard of. For centuries, pilgrims and merchants trudged along the Via Francigena, a route that traced ancient Roman highways from Canterbury all the way to Rome. That road did more to shape the map and fortunes of medieval Europe than any single cathedral. Real power didn't come from stone and stained glass. It came from controlling how people and goods moved, how water flowed, how taxes were collected, how messages traveled. This was the hidden infrastructure that actually determined who ruled and why. Kings and bishops understood this. They poured resources into roads, bridges, and waterways, not just into stone fortresses. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the old imperial roads didn't vanish. They became the nervous system of medieval trade, military movement, and royal communication, quietly enabling everything from coronations to rent collection. A single broken bridge could disrupt a kingdom's tax revenue for months. So if a network of gravel and paving stones was more valuable than a castle, why do we remember the castle? And what other invisible systems were even more decisive? The answer lies in the systems we can't see, the most overlooked piece of medieval infrastructure. The road itself, the Roman roads, did not vanish. Kings and bishops maintained and extended them. Take the road from Paris to Orleans, a maintained royal road wide enough for carts to move at speed. Speed was power. A king whose messengers could reach Orleans in 3 days instead of 5 could collect taxes faster, respond to rebellions sooner, and coordinate campaigns before the enemy knew he had moved. Charlemagne understood this better than most. His empire spanned modern France, Germany, and Italy, and he kept it together by enforcing road patrols, bridge tolls, and relay stations. Every count along a major route kept the road passable. A broken bridge threatened the entire realm's revenue and troop movement. Charlemagne's capitularies are full of instructions about road repair. He knew a good road was worth more than 100 castles. For many medieval lords, controlling a strategic road was more desirable than owning a castle. A castle could defend territory, but a road generated wealth through tolls, market access, and transport fees. The Domesday Book recorded not just land and livestock, but also road conditions and maintenance obligations. That record shows the skeleton of power, a network that determined how quickly the king could reach any corner, extract taxes, and learn of rebellion. The English royal roads were wider, better maintained, and protected by the king's peace. Travel on them was faster and safer, meaning the king's authority traveled with them. Local lords who let sections fall into disrepair were fined heavily. A bad road was a sign that the king's reach had weakened. The message was clear. Power flows along the road, and whoever controls its surface controls the speed of the realm. Yet even the best road could be stopped by a single broken bridge. A broken bridge was more than an inconvenience. It was a deliberate act of war. A single bridge could turn a thriving trade route into a standstill overnight, which is why rulers fought over them as fiercely as castles. A bridge was a bottleneck, and whoever controlled it could decide who crossed, what they carried, and how much they paid. The toll system was simple but devastatingly effective. Every cart, pack animal, and pedestrian paid a fee to cross. For a busy crossing over a major river, that income could rival an entire county's revenue. Kings granted bridge rights to loyal lords or built bridges themselves, keeping the tolls as royal income. The Pont d'Avignon on the Rhône was a prime example. Built in the 12th century, partly funded by pilgrims, its real value lay in the tolls. Merchants moving salt, wine, and textiles paid to cross. The bridge also gave Avignon control over access to the papal enclave later, making it a strategic choke point in regional politics. When a bridge collapsed or was deliberately destroyed, the economic ripple effect was immediate. Towns that lost their crossing saw trade reroute, revenues dry up, and their importance shrink. That is why bridge repair was a regular item in medieval budgets and royal decrees. A broken bridge did not just slow traffic, it broke the flow of power. The practical consequence was clear. A single stone arch over a river could make a ruler richer or ruin a rival's trade, all without raising a single castle wall. Bridges point to water, but water itself was an even more vital resource, and control of water was often invisible. A medieval city could not survive without a reliable supply of clean water, and whoever secured that supply held the city's fate. Roman aqueducts had been engineering marvels, and medieval rulers did not abandon them. They repaired, extended, and built new ones because water was too important to leave to chance. Just as bridge repair was a budget priority, so too was water management. Take Constantinople. The Valens Aqueduct, built in the 4th century, carried water over 40 kilometers from the hills of Thrace into the city, much of it underground or on high stone arches. When the aqueduct worked, Constantinople could support hundreds of thousands of people, along with fountains, baths, and cisterns. When it failed, the threat was starvation and disease, a disruption that could cripple the city faster than any siege. So the emperor personally oversaw the aqueduct's maintenance. It was a matter of political stability, not just public works. Across Europe, local bishops and lords controlled the wells, springs, and ornamental fountains that became symbols of civic pride. In Paris, the bishop controlled the main water sources. His authority to grant or deny access translated directly into political influence over the city's growth and daily life. A fountain in the main square was a statement that the ruler could provide what everyone needed. The same principle applied to markets. A market was not a natural gathering. It was a legal privilege granted by a king, bishop, or lord. That charter allowed a town to hold a weekly market or annual fair, and whoever held the charter shaped the local economy. Markets drew people, brought coins into circulation, and generated taxes on every transaction. The ruler controlled a steady stream of revenue and the rhythm of commerce. When it opened, what could be sold and who could sell. This was sovereignty carved into institutional form. The most dramatic example was the Champagne fairs. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the county of Champagne became the crossroads of European trade. 4 times a year, the counts hosted massive fairs that lasted weeks. They offered safe conduct and standardized weights and measures, and in return collected tolls and taxes that made them among the wealthiest lords in Europe. Their power came not from a castle or cathedral, but from a legal framework that turned a temporary gathering into an international institution. In London, the Fair of St. Bartholomew, granted by royal charter, filled the king's treasury with tolls while the prior kept a portion. Even the church participated in this hidden infrastructure. The location and timing of a market could make or break a town. A clashing market day could drain prosperity. A costly bridge toll could divert trade. Rulers used these levers deliberately, granting markets to loyal towns and withholding them from rivals. But markets and fairs only worked if people had reliable money. Control of coinage was the next hidden system, the link between economics and sovereignty. The right to mint coins was a fundamental attribute of power, jealously guarded by kings and emperors because whoever controlled coinage controlled the terms of exchange. Silver had to be mined, refined, and transported to a mint, and the location of that mint was itself a strategic asset. A ruler who could not secure a steady supply of precious metal could not maintain his currency, and without good currency, trade stalled, taxes became unpredictable, and soldiers went unpaid. That is why the Carolingian reforms of the 8th and 9th centuries were so decisive. Charlemagne standardized the silver penny across his vast empire, its weight and purity enforced by law, so that a trader in Aachen and a peasant in Aquitaine could use the same coin and trust its value. That uniformity did more to unite the Frankish realm than any single battle or cathedral. The conflict between local and royal coinage revealed the same pattern. In England, the Domesday Book recorded not just land and livestock but also the locations of mints, and by the 12th century only royal mints were allowed. Local lords who had once struck their own coins were forced to give up that privilege, a quiet victory for centralized power written in stamped silver. Here is the concrete discovery. The value of a coin was not in its metal alone. It was in the authority behind it. A penny from a king with a strong army and stable tax system was worth more than a penny from a weak one, even if they weighed the same. So communication was itself a hidden infrastructure, a system for moving not goods or coins but orders and intelligence. And in the Middle Ages, the speed and reliability of that system determined who could actually govern a kingdom. The Carolingian kings understood this. Charlemagne established a network of royal messengers known as the Scara, using relays of horses and dedicated stations. An order from Aachen could reach the far corners of his empire in weeks, not months. That was power, not because the message was written on impressive parchment, but because it arrived while the situation was still relevant. By the time of Philip Roman IV of France in the late 13th century, the royal courier service was a sophisticated operation. Specially mounted messengers traveled between prearranged posts, changing horses every 15 to 20 miles. They could cover over 100 miles in a single day. That meant the king in Paris could learn about a revolt in Toulouse, issue a response, and have troops redirected before local lords could coordinate a defense. Speed was sovereignty, but the crown was not the only player. The church ran its own information network, using the vast web of monasteries, bishoprics, and pilgrimage routes as relay points. Papal decrees, letters of excommunication, and news of councils traveled along these same roads, often faster than royal messages. A bishop in remote Bavaria might hear of a new pope before the local count heard of a new tax. This created a parallel system of authority that kings could not fully control, and that is the complication. Efficient postal systems were expensive to maintain. They required horses, riders, and secure posts. When war or famine strained royal finances, the courier network was often the first to suffer. A king who could not afford to send messages was a king losing touch with his realm. The hidden infrastructure of communication was also a hidden vulnerability, but if communication could fail, so could the food supply. Feeding a kingdom required more than fertile soil. It needed infrastructure that most people never thought about, mills that turned grain into flour and drainage systems that turned marshes into fields. In most of medieval Europe, the right to build and operate a mill belonged to the local lord. Peasants could not grind their own grain. They had to carry it to the lord's mill and pay a portion of their harvest as a fee. This was a monopoly enforced by law and custom. The miller was the lord's agent, and the mill itself was a constant source of income, year after year, without the lord having to lead a single soldier. Water mills along major rivers were often owned by kings or abbeys. Each produced a steady stream of grain and coin. A well-placed mill could generate as much revenue as the taxes from an entire village. A castle cost a fortune to garrison and maintain, but a mill paid for itself in a season and kept generating profit for decades. Then there was drainage. Wetlands covered vast areas that produced almost nothing. Whoever could drain that land could turn it into fertile farmland and claim the rent from every acre. The most dramatic example was the draining of the fens in eastern England. Starting in the 12th century, the Bishop of Ely and other monastic landlords invested in systematic drainage, digging channels, building sluices, and installing wind pumps. Over generations, they transformed thousands of acres of bog into some of the richest agricultural land in the kingdom. The bishop's palace at Ely was not just a seat of spiritual authority. It was built on the hidden wealth of drained water, but there was another kind of hidden power, one that was not under the plow but above it, in the deep shade of the forest. To the medieval eye, a forest was not a wilderness. It was a carefully managed resource, and in many kingdoms it belonged to the crown by a law that overruled all others. This was forest law, a separate legal system that placed vast tracts of woodland under the king's exclusive control, and that control was immensely profitable. Take the New Forest in southern England. William the Conqueror designated it as a royal forest, supposedly evicting villages and destroying churches to create his personal hunting ground. Whether that story is fully true or not, the point stands. Forest law gave the king authority over timber, game, and grazing across thousands of acres. The timber alone was worth a fortune: oaks for shipbuilding, beeches for charcoal, ash for spear shafts. And the game was not just for sport. Venison and boar were luxury food that feasted the royal household and rewarded loyal nobles. But the forest's value went deeper. Grazing rights, pannage for pigs, collection of firewood. These were all privileges that the king could grant or withhold, and every grant came with a fee or a service. The officials who enforced forest law, the foresters and verderers, were a shadow administration that answered only to the crown. They could fine, imprison, or even mutilate those who broke the forest ordinances. That was not tyranny for its own sake. It was the king protecting his most valuable hidden asset. And here is the changed perspective. The royal forest was not a relic of nature but a piece of infrastructure, legal, economic, and administrative. It generated more steady income than many castles ever did, and its real power was invisible to anyone who saw only trees. Metal was the other treasure beneath the medieval landscape. Silver and gold made coins possible, and coins were the language of royal authority. Control the mines meant control the currency, and control the currency meant control the realm. Medieval mining was dangerous work. Miners followed ore seams by candlelight, hacking rock with picks and hauling it in baskets. Water flooding tunnels required engineering feats. But the reward was enormous. A rich silver strike could fill a treasury faster than any tax. Kings granted special charters to mining towns, self-government, tax exemptions, their own courts. These were calculated investments to ensure a steady flow of silver into the royal mint. Consider Cathedrals in the Kingdom of Bohemia. In the late 13th century, its silver deposits were among the richest in Europe. King Wenceslaus II seized direct control of the mines and mint. He issued the Prague groschen, which became the dominant currency of Central Europe for centuries. Cathedrals boomed, its population swelled, its streets filled with merchants. The king's power grew accordingly. He could pay armies, hire bureaucrats, finance alliances. All from the ground beneath a hillside town. Tourists today visit the Gothic Cathedral of St. Barbara, a monument to the town's former wealth. They rarely think about the pits and tunnels that actually paid for it. The cathedral was a symbol, but the mines, smelters, stamp mills, and royal mint were the hidden machinery of power, controlled not by local lords but by the king and his officials. The mining district was a zone of royal authority carved into the feudal landscape, the same pattern repeated across Europe. In the Siegerland of Germany, iron mines made the Counts of Nassau wealthy enough to challenge their neighbors. In the Harz Mountains, silver mines funded the expansion of the Holy Roman Empire. In every case, the visible castles were built to protect the invisible wealth flowing from underground. The monument was the effect, the mine was the cause. The same pattern of hidden wealth driving visible power played out in the wool trade, Europe's most valuable commodity for centuries. English sheep produced the finest raw wool, but real profits came from finishing it into cloth. That required concentrated industrial infrastructure, fulling mills, dye works, looms, skilled labor. Towns that hosted these facilities gained leverage over kings. Bruges in modern Belgium was a cloth-finishing powerhouse in the 13th and 14th centuries. Wool arrived from England and was processed in workshops along its canals. The city controlled the entire finishing process, captured most of the value, and attracted merchants from across Europe. Its power infrastructure was the docks, weighing houses, and covered market where cloth was inspected. These unglamorous buildings generated staggering wealth. Control of textile infrastructure was direct political power. English kings imposed heavy taxes on wool exports to fund campaigns against France, understanding that whoever controlled supply could influence the continent. Flemish cloth towns used their economic muscle to win charters and privileges from feudal overlords. The merchant class that emerged owed its status not to birth or land but to looms, trade routes, and legal privileges, a kind of power harder for a king to predict. The Hanseatic League later built a commercial empire on cloth, grain, and timber, all moved through infrastructure that left few towering monuments. All this economic activity generated taxes, and the network for collecting them was the true nervous system of the state. The response to those autonomous commercial zones was not more castles but a hidden administrative machine. The tax collection network, the ability to assess wealth, collect revenue, and enforce payment became the ultimate test of sovereignty. It required records, officials, storehouses, and a bureaucracy stretching from the king's court to the humblest village. Take the Domesday Book. William the Conqueror commissioned it in 1086 as a tax assessment instrument. Every manor, every hide of land, every plough team was recorded. The goal was to know exactly what England was worth and then extract the geld with surgical precision. Stored in the royal archive, it was a database of wealth that let the crown bypass local lords and tax directly. That was a radical act of centralization. But a book alone does nothing. In England, sheriffs acted as the king's agents in each county, collecting a fixed annual sum and keeping any surplus. This created incentives for efficiency and for abuse. The exchequer audited every payment using its checkered cloth and notched tally sticks. The pipe rolls, parchment scrolls of receipts from the 12th century onward, show exactly how much coin flowed from each region into the king's coffers. In France, the crown's officials collected the taille on commoners and later the gabelle on salt. King Louis Roman IX sent out inquisitors to inspect local administration and root out corruption, the auditors of their age. Compare that hidden infrastructure to a castle. A castle is static. It guards territory but generates nothing. A tax network is dynamic, pulling wealth from hundreds of communities and funneling it to the center. When medieval rulers wanted to grow powerful, they refined their bureaucracy, streamlined assessment, and demanded better records that funded armies, built roads, and maintained the infrastructure that made further taxation possible. Taxes funded not only the military but also the roads, bridges, markets, and mints that generated even more taxable wealth. A well-maintained road meant faster tax collection. A secure bridge allowed reliable tolls. A stable coinage made payments standard. The system was self-reinforcing. The more efficiently a king could tax, the more he could invest in the infrastructure that created new taxable activity. That feedback loop was the real engine of medieval state building. That tax network pulled coins from fields and villages, but the real rivers of wealth flowed from the coast. Harbors were the medieval equivalent of oil ports today, points where goods from across the sea met land routes and where money changed hands. A typical medieval port wasn't just a beach with boats. It was a carefully organized facility, stone quays for unloading, warehouses for storing cloth, wine, and spices, and a customs house where everything was weighed, inspected, and taxed. The customs house was the heart of the operation. Inside, clerks recorded every shipment, assessors calculated duties, and inspectors checked for contraband. That administrative machinery was invisible to the passing sailor, but it was the real source of power. Customs duties on a single busy harbor could rival the income from an entire county. Kings fought for the right to collect them. They granted charters, built fortified warehouses, and appointed loyal officials to oversee the flow. Consider the Cinque Ports in southeast England: Hastings, Romney, Hythe, Dover, Sandwich, and later Winchelsea and Rye. These harbors formed a confederation that provided the Royal Navy with ships and crews in exchange for extraordinary privileges: exemption from most taxes, the right to hold their own courts, and self-governance. This was a deal based on infrastructure. The king got a ready-made naval force and a system that collected customs efficiently. The ports got the freedom to manage their own trade. No castle could match that. A castle guarded a harbor, but it didn't generate wealth. The customs house did. The port's real strength lay in its record-keeping, its legal privileges, and its ability to process ships quickly. The Cinque Ports were not just harbors. They were a hidden tax and defense system that made medieval England's commerce possible. Their power was invisible but absolute. Harbors were nodes, but the connections between them, sea lanes and river routes, were equally crucial. And that brings us to the rivers. If harbors were the front door, rivers were the main hallway. A single river could carry more goods in a day than a road in a week. Barrels of wine, bales of wool, slabs of stone, all floated downstream on rafts or barges, while grain and salt moved upstream against the current. But rivers weren't free. Every stretch of navigable water belonged to someone who charged for the privilege of using it. The Rhine is the classic example. From the 10th century onward, lords and bishops built castles not primarily to defend territory, but to control toll stations. They chose narrow bends where the current slowed or where the river passed between steep cliffs. Every merchant had to stop, pay a fee based on cargo and boat size, and receive a receipt that allowed passage to the next station. By the 13th century, there were dozens of toll points between Basel and the North Sea. The toll could amount to 10 or even 20% of the cargo's value. That was not tax evasion, it was the system. Now, the stone castles that survive today on the Rhine are magnificent. We photograph them, we take river cruises to admire them, but the real power did not come from the walls. It came from a legal document, a toll charter, and from the armed men who enforced collection. The castle was just a guardhouse for a cash register. Lords who controlled a single profitable bend could become richer than many counts who owned vast estates inland. And the merchants had no choice. They could drag goods overland at huge cost or submit to the tolls. That is why, when a king wanted to weaken a rival, he didn't besiege his castle. He granted a competing toll charter on a neighboring stretch of river, siphoning off the traffic. The power was in the river itself and in the right to say stop. That right to say stop, encoded in a toll charter, was not limited to rivers. It was the same kind of document that created towns. Throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, lords across Europe began offering something far more valuable than stone walls. They offered legal privileges. A town charter was a written grant from a king, duke, or bishop. It gave a settlement the right to hold a market, collect tolls, elect its own officials, and in many cases govern itself under its own customs. The charter turned a cluster of huts into a legal entity, and because a chartered town attracted merchants, craftsmen, and taxable wealth, lords competed to issue them. The classic example is Freiburg im Breisgau, founded in 1120 by Duke Conrad of Zeringen. The town grew so fast that its charter became a template copied by dozens of new towns from the Rhine to the Baltic. The physical layout of Freiburg, its market square, its straight streets, its position relative to the river, was infrastructure, but the charter was the invisible architecture that made it all work. We remember the cathedrals and the city walls. but the forgotten foundation of urban power was a piece of paper that said who could trade, who could judge, and who was free. The most extensive administrative network in the Middle Ages belonged not to any kingdom but to the church. We tend to think of the medieval church in terms of cathedrals, the spires of Chartres, the rose windows of Notre Dame. But those were just the public face. Behind them lay a hidden infrastructure that rivaled any kingdom in efficiency and reach. Consider the monasteries. They were not just places of prayer but economic engines. Cluny in Burgundy controlled hundreds of dependent priories across Europe. Each priory was a node moving goods, money, and information. Cluny's abbots oversaw production of grain, wine, wool, and livestock. They built mills, drained marshes, managed forests. The monastery was landlord, banker, and market coordinator. Its scriptoria produced account books, charters, and letters that kept the network running. The Cistercians took agricultural infrastructure further with sophisticated water management. Their granges, farm outposts worked by lay brothers, were models of efficient estate management. At its peak, the order operated hundreds of granges across Europe, each tied into the larger network. A Cistercian abbot could move resources across hundreds of miles without a single coin changing hands. Beyond the monasteries, bishoprics formed their own administrative skeleton. Dioceses often predated the kingdoms themselves. Bishops held synods, sent couriers, and maintained written records. Kings relied on this communication network to announce taxes or crusades. Every cathedral had clerks managing revenues, legal cases, and correspondence. The church was the largest corporation in medieval Europe, its infrastructure invisible behind the spire. But that infrastructure was not just about wealth or administration. It was about control of daily life. The church's bells marked the hours of work and prayer. Its calendar dictated when markets could be held, when fields were planted, when debts were due. Its records held the memory of who owned what, who was free and who was serf, who was married and who was legitimate. The church did not just manage land and money. It managed time, knowledge, and identity. The church's control of time through bells was powerful, but it had a limitation. The bells rang according to the abbot's schedule, not the town's. The mechanical clock changed that. In the late 13th century, towns across Europe began installing public clocks in their market squares and town halls. These were not just timepieces, they were political statements. A clock said, "We are the center, we set the schedule, we control when the market opens and closes, when the gates shut, when the workday begins." The Strasbourg Cathedral clock, finished in 1354, was one of the most elaborate. It showed the hours, the calendar, the movements of the planets, the phases of the moon. But more than a spectacle, it was a tool of civic authority. The city council paid for it. They hired the best clockmakers. They made sure the clock was visible from the square, not just inside the cathedral. It announced that Strasbourg was a city that governed itself, that understood time, that had the knowledge to measure and organize. The clock was a monument, yes, but the real infrastructure was the institution of regulated time itself. Meanwhile, record-keeping was becoming its own kind of infrastructure. Town archives, guild registers, court rolls, tax ledgers, these were the memory of the community. Whoever controlled the archive could prove who owned what, who owed what, who was who. A lord with no written records could be outmaneuvered by a town with a charter. A merchant with a signed contract could cross borders. The Domesday Book was the extreme example, but every significant settlement had its chest full of parchment. That chest was as valuable as any tower. The infrastructure of knowledge, time, and writing was invisible, but it governed daily life more than any wall. The Hanseatic League was an entire empire that operated almost entirely on invisible systems. It was a loose confederation of merchant guilds and market towns stretching from the Baltic to the North Sea. It had no single capital, no grand palace, no towering cathedral proclaiming supremacy. What it had was a network of trading posts called contours, built on legal privileges and standardized practices rather than stone and mortar. Take the Steelyard in London. It was a walled compound on the Thames with quays, warehouses, a meeting hall, and its own jurisdiction. Hanseatic merchants there were exempt from many local laws, paid lower tolls, and could trade freely. That was not a castle defending territory. It was infrastructure designed to control the flow of goods. The real power lay in agreements that allowed them to operate, and in the standard weights and measures enforced across hundreds of cities. The League's so-called pound weight became the benchmark for trade in Northern Europe. If your scales did not match theirs, your goods were rejected. They controlled through economic leverage, not military force. When a town resisted their terms, they simply redirected trade to another port, crippling the local economy. The Treaty of Stralsund in 1370, which forced the King of Denmark to grant them trade privileges, carried as much weight as any royal charter. Their empire was a web of contracts and warehouses, of cranes and quays and ships. They built few monuments, but they moved grain from Prussia to Flanders, furs from Novgorod to Bruges, herring from the Baltic to Cologne. The League proves that power could exist without a single iconic building. Its influence was real and lasting, yet it rested on a standard weight, a treaty clause, a row of barrels in a warehouse, a harbor that never slept. That was the engine of their power, not a castle wall but a network of customs and connections. The Capetian kings of France took a different path. They used infrastructure not just to tax trade but to reshape their kingdom. When Philip Augustus took the throne in 1180, he controlled little more than the Isle de France. His authority was surrounded by powerful dukes and counts who collected their own tolls and enforced their own rules. Philip understood that roads were the nervous system of the realm and that whoever controlled them controlled the kingdom. So he began building what became known as the Chemins du Roi, royal roads maintained by the crown and protected by royal justice. On these roads, merchants could travel without fear of arbitrary seizure. The king's peace was a practical promise. Any crime against a traveler on a royal road was a crime against the king. Louis Roman IX, later Saint Louis, expanded the system, sending sergeants to patrol the highways and ensuring local lords could not interfere with commerce that passed through their lands. The effect was immediate. Towns along the royal roads boomed. Trade that once crept along dangerous local paths now moved swiftly and predictably. Paris, already the capital, became a hub where roads from every direction converged. The Grands Ponts, the bridges over the Seine, were rebuilt and controlled directly by the crown. Every cart that entered Paris paid tolls to the king's agents, and those tolls funded more roads, more bridges, more courts. The early Louvre was a modest fortress, nothing like the palace we think of today. It was a statement of presence, not a seat of grandeur. The real engine of Capetian power was not the stone walls of the Louvre but the graded roads that led to it and the bridge towers that collected the revenue. Road security allowed royal fairs to flourish, especially the Foire du Landit near St. Denis, which drew merchants from across Europe. The king's ability to guarantee a safe journey was more valuable than any castle garrison. The monuments we remember, Sainte-Chapelle and the Louvre, were only possible because of a far more humble structure: a graded road, a guarded bridge, a safe passage for a merchant's cart. That was the infrastructure that made the monuments possible. But here is the deeper paradox that changes how you read every medieval ruin. The monuments were not the source of power. They were its product. Take Notre Dame de Paris. That cathedral is a masterpiece, but what paid for it? Not donations from the faithful alone. It was the economic boom generated by the royal roads, bridge tolls, and market fairs. When the kings built and secured the highways into Paris, they turned the city into a commercial magnet. Every cart of grain, every bolt of cloth, every cask of wine that entered the capital paid a toll to the crown. Those tolls filled the royal treasury, and that treasury funded the cathedral. The stone vaults of Notre Dame were lifted by the silver of toll collectors, not by piety alone. The cathedral's grandeur was a direct result of the king's ability to secure and tax the roads. This pattern repeated across France. Consider Carcassonne. That iconic fortress looks like the ultimate symbol of military power, but it was built to control the road between the Mediterranean and Aquitaine and to guard the Aude River crossing. The castle protected a trade corridor that generated wealth through tolls and customs. Without the road and the river, Carcassonne was just a very expensive pile of stone. This is the monument paradox. Infrastructure preceded monuments. The wealth came first, collected through systems of movement and exchange. The monuments were advertisements for that wealth, or thank offerings for it, but never the engine. The engine was the graded road, the guarded bridge, the market charter, the mint, the tax roll. And when that infrastructure decayed, the monuments remained empty of context, mocking us with their permanence while the real machinery of power rotted into dust. Stone monuments survive, wooden bridges and gravel roads rot. That simple material fact shapes what we remember. A cathedral was built to stand for centuries. A medieval road was usually just gravel or cobbles on compacted earth. It wore down, got muddy, needed constant maintenance. Toll houses crumbled. The infrastructure that moved goods and armies was built to be functional, not eternal. It was repaired, rerouted, replaced. The original Roman road under a medieval town might be covered by new stone or paved over for a modern highway. You walk on it every day without knowing. Then there is the selective eye of history. Chroniclers described battles, coronations, and building projects. They rarely recorded that a bridge toll was raised or a road regraveled. That was mundane, unworthy of parchment. Later historians and tourists followed the same instinct. They gravitated toward the dramatic silhouette on the hill, not the muddy track through the valley. The ruin of a castle is a story. The ruin of a road is just a ditch, and yet that ditch was what fed the castle. The Via Appia, even as a looted dirt track, still carried tax collectors and merchants. It was invisible because it was useful. That same blindness operates today, and that lesson is not just about the Middle Ages. The most powerful forces shaping your life today are not skyscrapers or monuments. They are fiber optic cables under the ocean, shipping lanes that carry 90% of global trade, satellite networks, and tax codes. These are the hidden infrastructures of the 21st century. Consider the Suez Canal. Billions of dollars in goods pass through that narrow channel every day. A single blockage can freeze supply chains and shift prices across the world. The canal itself is unremarkable from satellite view, but its control gives Egypt geopolitical leverage far beyond its military size. The same logic applies to the Internet's physical backbone. It is a network of undersea cables and landing stations. The nations that control those cables hold enormous power over communication, finance, and surveillance. That infrastructure is almost invisible, yet it determines who can speak, how fast money moves, and where intelligence flows. The parallel to medieval roads and bridges is direct. Then, a toll on a bridge could fund a kingdom. Now, a tariff on data or a choke point on a shipping lane can shift the balance of global power. And just as medieval chroniclers ignored the gravel road, modern headlines focus on the flashy tower or the presidential palace while the real engine of power hums silently in server rooms and port terminals. The bias remains. We celebrate the symbol and forget the system that makes it possible. The real power lies not in the monuments we photograph, but in the hidden networks that we take for granted until they fail. The road network that moved armies and tax collectors, the bridge tolls that funded the crown, the water supply that kept cities alive, the right to mint coins and the silver mines that made them possible. The legal charter that turned a village into a market town and the fair that attracted merchants from across Europe. Every one of these systems was mundane, often invisible, rarely celebrated. Yet together they formed the real skeleton of authority. The same pattern held for every facet of medieval life. The church depended on its network of monasteries, its system of tithes, its control over education and communication. The Hanseatic League built counting houses and trade agreements, not a capital. The king's authority rested more on the sheriff who collected taxes than on the 1,000-year-old crown he wore. But this new way of seeing history leaves one final reflection. Power in the Middle Ages and in any era was never really about the monuments we celebrate. It was about the invisible systems that controlled movement, resources, and information. The roads, the water supply, the legal charters, the coinage, the tax networks were the real engines of authority. The castles and cathedrals were not the source of power. They were advertisements built from the wealth that hidden infrastructure generated. Monuments were the tip of the iceberg. The vast mass of ordinary systems beneath determined who truly ruled. Understanding this changes how we see not only medieval history but the world around us today. The same principle holds. The most important structures determining who holds power are often the ones we overlook. So what hidden piece of infrastructure in your town today do you think shapes local power more than any monument? I would love to read your answer in the comments. If you enjoyed seeing history from a different angle, subscribe for more insights that challenge what you thought you knew about power, progress, and the built world. Because the monuments were merely advertisements, the infrastructure was the real product.